Awesome. I like the idea.
Wow.
Yes, yes. But yes, I think everybody's online now. Why don't we start? I think it's already 11. So you guys are all fine. Let's make
Yep.
a start. Let me try to share my screen here first. Can you all see my presentation?
Yep. Oh,
I
good.
can see it. Yep,
Oh,
looking
okay.
super snazzy there.
Okay.
Green
All
and
right.
green.
All right. Unfortunately, I can't see you all, but yeah, we'll make that work. But yeah, thank you everybody for joining us this morning. Thank you especially to Miranetta and KM team for extending this invitation for me to give a brief seminar on sort of my work. I'm sure most of you are quite familiar with me, but for those who may not be, my name is Ivan Diarra, and I am the PNEA Technical Support Officer. I'm here with the EMGB program at SPREP. I've been here for about a year now. Yeah, I think I'm turning close to a year now. So yeah, time flies. But yeah, before I joined SPREP, like I said, I was a graduate researcher at USP. And part of what I was doing was essentially trying to find nature-based solution around the issue of hazardous waste. And one of the topics that I was exploring was using plants, using nature to fix some of the contamination issue that we face here in the Pacific. So yeah, essentially that is my topic, phytoremediation, and can plants provide a greener, perhaps more cleaner, and um, a more effective way to sort of mediate and ameliorate contaminated environments in the Pacific. So perhaps, hopefully, through the course of the seminar today, I may be able to provide or provide some more insight into how this technology can be used here in the region. So again, I want this seminar to be more, engaging, and I want you all to contribute. And I know you guys certainly have some ideas of your own, so I want us to have some kind of back and forth. So I thought I'll start this with just a blank image. Um, this structure here is, I think, is a monument, perhaps, here in the Pacific. I don't know if any of you might recognize what this is, maybe where it's located. A hint, it's here in the Pacific, and maybe why this structure was constructed. Yeah, what purpose it serves. So does anyone recognize the structure? You're welcome to, jump on board and yeah.
It's a legacy of post-World War II testing of nuclear weapons in RMI. And it does not have a bottom. It has a top, but there's no bottom.
Perfect. You said it all, Paul. Yes, that's exactly what it is. But yeah, I'll discuss more about that later. But again, yeah, it's sort of a monument to sort of waste, hazardous waste issues here in the Pacific. But I'll touch more on that very briefly.
It looks
So
like the landing field of a UFO.
indeed, it looks like yeah, like a UFO, yeah, extraterrestrial, yeah, structure. Indeed, indeed. Good observation. Thank you. But yeah, let's pull out a little bit and look at sort of the hazardous waste issue globally. As we all know, hazardous waste is proliferating globally, and Pacific Islands are unfortunately not spared from this issue. I'm sure our colleagues from the waste management program would definitely agree that this is a growing issue here in the Pacific as well. And the problem with hazardous waste is they're dangerous both to the environment as well as human health. So they damage, they affect biodiversity. They also have a lot of effects on humans, on species, and so on. So some of the common pollutants that we discuss when we talk about hazardous waste, of course, there's a broad group. But some of the ones that we focus on usually what we call PAH. These are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. These are from fuels, diesel, petrol. We also have polychlorinated biphenyls. Also from fuel, we have benzene, toluene, ethyl benzene, and xylene. Again, also from fuel and other petroleum products. And we have what we call persistent organic pollutants. These are organic in nature, but unfortunately they persist in the environment for a long period, so they are considered hazardous or recalcitrant in some form. Again, we have heavy metals. These are also another class of contaminants that are growing, especially here in the Pacific Islands. In fact, in 2020, my co-authors and I published a paper, sort of a review paper, looking at the extent and the scale of heavy metal pollution in the Pacific Island country. Did I drop off? Is it back now?
You're back now, bro.
Oh, my apologies. Seems like, yeah, I dropped off for a minute there. But yes, like I was saying, I basically published a paper looking at heavy metal pollution here in the Pacific Islands. And sorry, can you guys hear me?
Yep, all good
Yes,
now.
you're clear.
All right, thank you. Yeah, and yeah, like I said, unfortunately, there is heavy metal contamination here in the Pacific Islands. Fortunately, what we found was that this contamination usually are only considered low to moderate levels, and not at the concentrations found in more polluted parts of the world. But nonetheless, this is an issue that needs some sort of focus, yeah, and better light shown on the issue. And yeah, we also have radionuclides, like Paul just said. Unfortunately, due to the legacy of nuclear weapon testing in the Pacific has become, some parts of the Pacific are indeed contaminated with radioactive isotopes and radionuclides. We also have emerging contaminants, new hazardous contaminants that are emerging. I don't know if you guys have heard of the term forever chemicals. Yeah, it's all in the news now, and I'm sure you guys must have come across that. Anybody heard of that?
Not that term, forever chemicals. Just that sounds new to me, although we know about man-made chemicals which don't break down in the environment, but that's an interesting new term as far as I'm concerned.
We've got these fire retardant fibers they use in like baby blankets and
To
stuff.
describe.
Terrible.
Go ahead, Paul.
I was saying one of them is a fire retardant fiber they use in kids' clothing and blankets, which is a good idea. Don't burn them up, but it lasts forever and it's toxic. Pretty
Exactly. Exactly. Spot on, Paul. So forever chemicals, just sort of a generic term used to describe what we call PFAS. This is, let me just use my highlighter here. Yeah, PFAS. These are called per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. So one thing about PFAS is they're very recalcitrant, they're very stubborn, and they persist for a long time. And as such, the term forever chemical is used. Like Paul said, because of that, recalcitrant nature, they're used in a lot of products like, water repellent clothing, um, your non-stick pans in the kitchen. Unfortunately, there's PFAS in there that is leaching into your food. A lot of fire retardants. So they do have a lot of industrial and household applications, but unfortunately, they are carcinogenic, very destructive, and they persist in the environment for a long time. And so they are becoming sort of an area of concern and an area of focus now because most part of the US, especially, you find PFAS in almost every environment. So more research is being done to find ways to sort of fix the problem because of that very recalcitrant and persistent nature of PFAS. Of course, we also have nanoparticles as nanotechnology sort of advances. We're having a lot of very tiny particles that are being created and unfortunately released into the environment. And again, because of their very tiny nature, it's very difficult to find an effective way to deal with these. Next, we also have pharmaceuticals, antibiotics released into the water, creating antibiotic resistance and so on, and microplastics. So, usually plastics are not considered hazardous waste. They're usually considered more of a solid waste problem. But as you've seen, microplastics have, because of the nature in which they're made, using a lot of hazardous chemicals and the way that they degrade in the environment, they sort of act very similar to hazardous waste. Once they're in the environment, they're toxic to biodiversity, to other species, and to humans as well. So I think now they're also being sort of looked at as potentially hazardous contaminants. So again, there's a lot more contaminants that are, emerging and we can look at. But the idea here is this is a major problem globally. And this is an issue that costs, global economy around 25 to 50 billion. This is just looking at, the health cost and the economic cost of hazardous waste. This is not factoring in the environmental costs, ecological costs, which of course is difficult to estimate or, to sort of put a figure on. The environment is invaluable. So we don't truly know the extent of which this hazardous waste are causing in terms of our environment. But of course, we do have regional and international sort of binding instruments and MEAs to sort of tackle and address some issues. I'm sure some of you have heard of the Basel, Stockholm, the Rotterdam Conventions. Of course, here in the Pacific, we have the Ghani Convention. So, these instruments have been around for a while, but of course, we can debate how effective they have been. Ratification has been a problem. And of course, enforcement has also been another issue with these. So perhaps we need to find new ways, to address these issues. And yes, that brings us to brownfields. Now, when we talk about brownfields, these are simply environments that have been widely contaminated with uh, hazardous contaminants. They're called brownfields because, when you look at the image here, you can spot some of the brown sort of fields or areas in the environment. The reason why the environment turns brown, it's usually indicative of, widespread pollution, because when a patch of field is brown, it usually points to the fact that the soil or the site cannot support vegetation. And when a site cannot support vegetation, it usually points to some sort of underlying contamination. So there are a lot of brownfield sites across the world. I think in the US alone, there's more than 500,000 brownfield sites. In some cases, they also refer to these as Superfund sites. I'm sure maybe Paul has heard of that. they're kind of interchangeable, but yeah, they're both areas that have been widely contaminated by hazardous pollutants and require some sort of treatment to remediate or restore these sites. The problem is, of course, most people who pollute the environment do not want to, fork out any money or, invest in cleaning up or restoring the environment. So usually these sites are just abandoned. People just, do their stuff, they destroy the environment, and they move on. And so these sites remain there just, as an eyesore, as very hazardous environments, and they stay there for a long time, for a long time. So you might be thinking, okay, do we have any brownfield sites here in the Pacific? I mean, when we talk about these stuff, we always, look outward, we always look at other countries, but do we have, such sites in the Pacific? Yes, we do. So an example of a brownfield site here in the Pacific would be the Lamy dump site in Fiji. I think we have some Fijians on the call, so I'm sure maybe Vani knows the Lamy dump site. So the Lamy dump site has been used in Fiji, I think, since the 1950s as just sort of a repository for all sort of waste. I think we're coming from Suva and other major urban areas in Fiji. The problem with the Lamy dump site was that it wasn't properly planned. So it was just, designated in the 1950s, and since then, rubbish, sort of dumps have just been, um, you know, um, released there. And so the problem is, it's close to the marine environment. So a lot of these wastes have been leaching and making their way into the marine environment, destroying a lot of species, a lot of sensitive receptors, and so on. So recently, I think in 2010, something around then, the Fiji government sort of designed a new modern landfill that's called Nambo landfill. And so they moved away from the Lamy dump site, and now all or most waste products in Fiji are handled by the Nambo landfill. They have a more advanced and a modern waste processing facility there. So unfortunately, the Lamy dump site is now sort of being left barren. It's not being used anymore as a land site, as a dump field, but unfortunately, it's still hazardous, and it can't be used for, any other purpose, not for agriculture, certainly not for any residential purposes. So it just sits there, barren, open, with a lot of contamination. Another brownfield site would be the Panguna mine in PNG. So a lot of mine sites, when they closed, they sort of just, left to rot away or, remain in the environment for a long time without any kind of measure to restore or to reclaim the site. So in some of the larger Pacific Island countries where a lot of mining takes place, this is very common. There's a lot of abandoned mine sites, which again contain a lot of hazardous waste from the mining process. A lot of chemicals are used during mining, as well as some of the contaminants that have been extracted from the environment. A lot of heavy metals, um, a lot of cyanide used during the process, and yeah, a lot of contaminants. And these are all sort of just left and abandoned there, and they continue to affect the environment. They continue to have their own impact and perhaps leach, and the area of influence continues to expand if nothing is done. So now you may be thinking, what can we do to, or what is being done to sort of address um, contaminated areas and polluted areas? Well, there are a range of what we call conventional remediation techniques, which have been applied, globally. A lot of success as well as a lot of failures. Nonetheless, they exist. I think these are classified into what we call physical methods, So here, we're simply trying to, by using physical methods, we're simply trying to restrict further spread or further contamination of a contaminated site. So the problem with physical methods is they don't fix the underlying issue. They just quick fix, just sort of prevent further leaching and secondary contamination and so on. But they do not remove the contamination from the environment. So examples of physical methods are surface capping, also excavation, where you excavate the soil and you go dispose of it, and maybe you replace that with maybe a cleaner soil or something on the surface which is cleaner. Encapsulation, where you try to encapsulate the contaminated area. We also have what we call electrokinetic separation, using electricity to separate the ions. So this brings us to my initial image, the one I showed up on my first slide. So like Paul said, that is actually called the Runic Dome, and that is located in Enewetak Atoll in Marshall Islands. So like Paul was saying, due to the legacy of nuclear weapons testing here in the Pacific by the U.S. government and other Western allies, there's been a lot of nuclear waste that was left behind in the Marshall Islands and some of the Northern Pacific countries. So once the U.S. government, saw that that was a main issue, they decided to simply, erect or build these domes or these structures to sort of house, or sort of, contain a lot of the radioactive waste that was left behind. So unfortunately, what we're seeing now is that, again, this structure is only going to last for so long. Radioactive isotopes are going to be there for thousands and thousands of years, sometimes even longer. So this dome will eventually fail, and whatever contamination is in there will eventually be released. And in fact, a lot of studies are showing that, the contamination is sort of leaking or leaching, or this dome is not sort of holding in the radioactive waste as it should. So that's a problem with physical methods. They don't fix the underlying issue. They just give you more time, perhaps, to implement much more robust and much more effective remediation techniques. The technique we have, or another class of remediation techniques we can apply, are what we call chemical methods. Now, these are much more effective because they involve actually removing the pollutant from the very soil matrix from the lattice of the soil. So here you see the use of chemicals to sort of wash the soil. That's what we call soil washing. We also have what we call immobilization, where you use chemicals to change the chemistry of the pollutant in the soil and immobilize them to prevent further mobility. We also have chemical reduction, oxidation processes, and a lot of others. But the idea here is essentially to remove the contamination from the soil using some sort of industrial process. A lot of these methods are usually applied what we call ex situ, that's offsite. So again, you have to extract or excavate the pollution or the polluted media, whether it's soil or water, and then transport it to a facility where you have these technology and these structures where you can actually clean the soil. So you can't apply them on site. Lastly, we also have what we call thermal methods, and simply these involve the use of heat to either immobilize or to restrict further movement of the contamination. We have what we call thermal disruption, vitrification, pyrolysis, and incineration. So as you can see in the diagram here, we have a little schematic of the vitrification process. So vitrification essentially is where you heat the soil until it reaches very high temperature, and then the very structure of the soil changes. The soil becomes almost glass-like. So at that state, you just stop heating the soil and let it cool, and then you have this sort of glass structure that is created. And so all the contamination or the contaminated media, the soil or water, is held within that matrix. And so it immobilizes and prevents the contamination from spreading, and it's just held in that glass-like structure. But yeah, these are what we call conventional remediation techniques. So I'm going to touch a little bit about the limitations of conventional remediation techniques. One is, of course, they're very expensive. I think that's what makes them less appealing to, places like the Pacific. These are very expensive to apply, depending on the scale and the extent of the contamination. You can be looking at, millions and even billions, to effectively apply some of these techniques. Another issue is they're highly specific. So, like we know, a lot of contaminated sites are not contaminated with only one single pollutant. It's usually a host or a mix of different contamination, maybe heavy metals, petrochemicals, asbestos. There's a lot of things in there. So a lot of conventional techniques, unfortunately, they only apply to just one contaminant. So if you're dealing with a multiply contaminated area, conventional remediation techniques might not be the best approach to apply. Secondly, they're limited to small scale and shallow land areas. So again, like I said, because of their cost, you really can't apply this at a much larger scale. Usually at a very small area with limited contamination, then these methods can be applied. Another thing is they're highly destructive. Like I was saying, with vitrification, you're changing the very nature of the soil. You're sort of heating the soil to the point where it becomes this vitreous glass-like material. So of course, you're going to destroy much of the microbial diversity in soil. You're going to destroy a lot of the soil organic matter, and essentially, in some cases, the soil cannot be used for any other purpose. You've cleaned up the pollution, but then you've rendered the soil almost unusable for any other purpose. Another thing is low efficiency. Depending on which of these technologies you're applying, some of them are not very effective, and they might not give you the needed results that you're after. Like I said, again, they do not work well on sites that are multiply contaminated with a range of contaminants. Lastly, poor public acceptance. Conventional techniques are usually very, what would I say, are not the best method to apply because of there can be a lot of noise involved. They don't restore, they're not green, they're not clean, they don't restore the environment to its initial state. So a lot of people people in the public may not accept these types of technology because of how destructive they can also be. So, but these are some of the few challenges of conventional remediation techniques. So with that in mind, we're seeing a lot of shift towards what we call nature-based solutions. And the idea here is to try to work with nature in order to fix a lot of the environmental issues that are facing planet. So nature-based solutions are simply interventions that seek to protect, manage, and restore ecosystems to address societal challenges effectively and adaptively simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity effects. So nature-based solutions is simply, using nature to our own benefit, working with nature or working alongside nature rather than against nature. So we're seeing a lot of nature-based solution being applied across the world. I think here in the Pacific, SPREP itself is implementing some nature adaptation to climate change as a PPAC project. That's with climate change. We also have what we call the QR initiative, which provides funding to projects and initiatives that are implementing and using nature-based solutions. So these are a few that I think SPREP is currently implementing, and it's safe to say that a lot more are coming in the next few years because there's a huge global shift towards nature-based solutions. So these systems really have a lot of benefits to provide because, again, we're working with nature. According to the UN, nature-based solutions can provide more than a third of the climate change mitigation needed to reach goals to curb global warming by 2030. Another benefit is by planting trees, we can generate up to 9 trillion in net benefits. That's from carbon sequestration and other ecological benefits of tree planting. Again, mangrove forest can save an estimated 80 billion per year, avoided losses from coastal flooding, and it can help to protect up to 18 million people. So there is indeed a lot of benefit from working with nature and embracing nature in a lot of the interventions that we implement. So that brings us to phytoremediation. And I have to ask first, how many people have heard of the term phytoremediation, or maybe even worked on phytoremediation in some aspect? How many people have heard of the term before this? Are you guys there? I hope I'm just talking to myself.
We're here, we're here.
Okay. Unfortunately, I can't see you guys. But yes, phytoremediation is simply derived from two Latin words. It's a term that we get from two Latin words. So one is phyto, which means plants, and remedium, which means to remedy, to cure, to fix, or to clean. So essentially, when we combine that, phytoremediation simply is a technology that uses plants to degrade, extract, contain, immobilize contaminants from soil and water. That's essentially the basis or the idea behind phytoremediation, using plants to sort of fix some of the environmental contamination issues that we have. So again, this technology has been really gaining prominence lately. There's a lot of research, a lot of studies being done on phytoremediation, looking at how technology can be applied effectively, and if it has potential benefits and can be a sustainable alternative to some of the more recalcitrant and hard to apply remediation techniques that we currently use now. So when we look at phytoremediation, it's a broad term. There are certain mechanisms or how plants work to sort of remediate or remove pollutants from the environment. So one type of phytoremediation, one mechanism for applying phytoremediation is what we call rhizofiltration. So here we're essentially using plant roots to absorb and immobilize contaminants. This method is usually used for, of course, water and sediments. And the idea here is, again, to sort of use the plant roots and the rhizosphere, which is the area around the roots, to help clean up the water and any contaminants that are in the water. Next, we have what we call phytodegradation. So here, the pollutants are simply broken down in the root zone by enzymes produced by the plant with the help of microorganisms. So that one, of course, is what we call phytoevaporation. Here, pollutants are taken up in the plant, transformed into less toxic formed, and then released into the atmosphere. So this only works for some contaminants that are able to be what we call volatilized in the environment. And we also have phytostabilization. So here, plants simply stabilize the contaminants within the soil matrix. So again, the contaminants are not removed, but they are stabilized or immobilized within the soil. And then lastly, we have phytoextraction. And this is the most common form of phytoremediation. Here, we're simply trying to use the crops or the plants to essentially extract or get the plant to accumulate any contaminant that is in the soil. So once the plant accumulates the contaminant, all we have to do is harvest the plant and then find a way to process or to dispose or discard of the plant. This is the most widely applied form of phytoremediation, and it's also the easiest one to apply. So we talk about phytoremediation. You might be thinking, can we use any plant for phytoremediation? I mean, how do we determine if a plant is suitable for phytoremediation? And that brings us to what we call plant selection criteria. So of course, not all plants are suitable for phytoremediation. There's a specific group of plants that indeed work well. But plants generally respond to contamination in what we call 3 ways. One is by excluding the contamination from their bodies. So here, what the plant does is essentially exclude or restricts the uptake of pollutants into the aerial parts of the plant. That's the part of the plant that is above the ground. So as you can see in the little chart I have here on the left, exclude the plants, they sort of stabilize or ensure that the level of contamination in their bodies is at a sort of stable level as the level of contamination increases in the soil. But once it reaches a certain level where the plant can no longer exclude, then the concentration of metals in the plant increases, and the plant eventually dies, because heavy metals and other contaminants in soil can indeed be fatal and dangerous to the plants. So the plants are trying as best as they can to exclude and restrict the uptake of the metals. Next, we have indicator plants. Now, indicator plants simply accumulate contaminants in the soil at a proportionate level to the concentration. They call indicator plants because they simply indicate the presence of metal in the soil. They don't accumulate really high levels or completely exclude contamination. They simply concentrate the level of contamination in the soil proportionate to what is there in the soil. So as you can see here in the graph, as the level of metal and contamination in the soil increases, you can see that a bioindicator plant simply just increases at the same level of increase in the soil. And then lastly, we have what we call hyperaccumulator plants. Now, these are the plants that we use for phytoremediation. These are plants that are able to accumulate a lot of contaminants in their bodies. They have evolved some strategies to be able to withstand and accumulate a lot of contamination in their bodies without a lot of adverse effects or without even dying. So on the graph here, you can see how hyperaccumulated plant responds to high level of contamination in the soil. You can see as the level of contamination in the soil increases, the hyperaccumulated plant, accumulates more and more levels of contamination in its body, and this is what makes them really, really useful. The ability to accumulate, um, toxic elements thousands or hundreds of times above levels that a normal plant can. So again, when we're talking about plant selection criteria, how do we determine that a plant is a hyperaccumulator, or a plant can indeed accumulate a lot of hazardous pollutants? So one, we look at what we call the tolerance index. So tolerance index simply measures the ability of a plant to tolerate and grow in the presence of contamination. Most plants, normal plants, will not be able to grow on a contaminated soil because the contamination is hazardous, and it kills the plant. But plants that can grow on those sort of contaminated environments are usually because they're able to tolerate those sort of adverse conditions. So how do we measure the tolerance index of a plant? Well, we do that by looking at the biomass production. So what you do essentially is you have a control plant that grows on a normal substrate or an uncontaminated environment. And then you have a plant that is grown in your a contaminated environment, the contaminant of interest. So what you do is you compare the biomass production from those control plants that are grown in the soil without any contamination, and to those that are grown in a contaminated environment. If there's any difference in biomass, it shows that the plants that are growing in the contaminated soil are not doing well because perhaps the contamination is affecting their growth. So if you get sort of a number here that is maybe closer to 1, that shows that the plant is able to tolerate that contaminant, and that makes that plant a strong candidate to be used in phytoremediation. Next, we have what we call the bioconcentration factor. Now, it's one thing to be able to tolerate hazardous contamination, but the next thing is, can the plant actually bioconcentrate or uptake the contamination in the soil? So by using bioconcentration factor, we're able to measure the ability of the plant to actually extract and accumulate contaminants from the soil. So the bioconcentration factor is simply a function of the concentration of contaminant in the plant compared to the concentration in the soil. So you found you sort of divide that, and you find that the number is, the closer to 1 it is, the better the plant is at bioconcentrating that particular contaminant. Lastly, we have what we call the translocation factor. So this is an indication of a plant's ability to translocate contaminants from the roots to the aerial parts of a plant. So because most plants have very small roots, if all the contamination is only stored in the roots, it is not effective. You want the plant to be able to translocate or to transport whatever contaminant it's extracting its root into the aerial parts of the plant. Now that doesn't happen a lot because a lot of plants try to restrict the contamination to roots, like we said, excluder plants. they restrict the contamination to your roots, because once they allow any contamination into their flowers, their leaves, their stems, that can cause, um, a lot of DNA damage, a lot of protein damage, and eventually cause the plant to die. So plants that are actually able to transport and accumulate metals in their leaves, in their stems, in their branches, those plants are actually much better at phytoremediation. And these are what we call hyperaccumulating plants. So you might be wondering, she might think hyperaccumulator plants are some sort of special plants, that only exist in certain areas. But no, in fact, they're much more common than you think. I think there's about close to 500 species of hyperaccumulator plants so far discovered around the world. And almost every day or every month, there's a new hyperaccumulator plant that is discovered. So some common hyperaccumulator plants are, sunflower, Helianthus anus. Sunflower is a really good accumulator of heavy metals and some other toxic contaminants in the environment. And we have the brassica family, the cabbage family. So a lot of the cabbage, the bok choy, the kale, the lettuce you consume, those plants are actually able to extract and accumulate metals in the soil. So if they're grown in contaminated environments, then there's a danger that if you consume those plants or those vegetables that are grown in a contaminated environment, then there's a risk that you're also consuming a lot of those hazardous contaminants. You're ingesting or you're eating it. I'll touch more about this later because I have a case study from Fiji about, cabbage being grown on contaminated soils. So we also have Teres vitata, it's a Chinese spring fern, another good accumulator. We have vetiver grass, another very resilient crop that grows in a lot of conditions. And yes, it's also able to hyperaccumulate contaminants from the soil. And we have Sedum alfredi, Plasmodium purulescens. These are just the common hyperaccumulator species, ones that are usually used in research. There's a lot more groups, and like I said, there's a lot more that are being discovered and being studied every day. So you might be wondering, what are the factors that determine the success of phytoremediation? Well, we do have some factors that are very important to look at. And most of these factors are simply based on agronomy, because phytoremediation is, in many cases, just growing plants. Of course, there's a more detailed management process that goes in, but essentially it's just agriculture. So some of the agricultural processes you have to look at are the same things that apply when you're trying to apply phytoremediation. So one thing is the root zone. You need a plant that is able to produce what we call root exudates. So by producing that, the plant is able to break down some of the contamination in the soil because of the exudates. It's able to extract and accumulate contamination. Next is the addition of chelating ligands. Again, this is not a really important factor. It's only important if you're using chemicals to improve the remediation process. Next is the chemical characteristics of the contaminant. So not every plant works for every contaminant. You have to look at the characteristics of your contaminant and determine if the plant species you're using is effective and can work with the plant that you're trying to use. Another factor, of course, is the characteristics of the medium. So if your medium is soil, you're trying to, clean up a contaminated soil, then of course you want to look at, the pH of the soil, because the pH is either too low or too high. Of course, plants cannot grow and survive on that medium. So you're looking at the nature of the soil, is it, clayey, and just, general characteristics and properties of the soil you're working with. And next is the characteristics of the plant species. So, like I said, the plants you're trying to use should be plants that work with the contaminant you're trying to clean from the environment. So you should look at the characteristics of the plant, how fast it grows, what season it grows in, and all those kind of factors to look at if it's actually practical to use that particular plant species. And lastly, we have environmental conditions. Like I said, phytoremediation is just like agriculture. So just as, environmental conditions in agriculture, so too does it affect phytoremediation. So you have to ensure that, the rainfall is adequate, sunlight, it's not too harsh, or, it's not too low. So all these things and all these factors are what you have to, sort of carefully plan and carefully look at if you're trying to successfully apply phytoremediation. But yes. Sorry. I wanted to discuss just a case study, one of my experience that I had while I was doing my study in Fiji. So I had a colleague of mine who was working with sewage sludge. I'm sure most of you know sewage sludge. That's a byproduct of wastewater treatment. So, sewage sludge is very rich in nutrients, and as such, is widely used in agriculture around the world. It's used almost like a fertilizer, or, an amendment to improve soil fertility. But the problem with sewage sludge is in places where there's no strong standards in place, they often contain a lot of contamination as well. Because again, remember, they are the byproduct or the waste of wastewater treatment. So in a lot of countries, there's no standard around their disposal and how they use in agriculture. And that was the case in Fiji. Sewage sludge was being used. I'm not sure about the current situation, but was being used in Fiji as sort of, an amendment to agriculture. It was applied in farms. People go and, take them from the Kinoya wastewater treatment plant in Fiji, and they apply it in their farms, in their gardens, and so on. So one of my colleagues actually sort of went to a farm and that was using sewage sludge, and she wanted to determine if the plants being grown sewage sludge were actually accumulating any contamination from the soil. And what she found was that indeed bok choy and other vegetables that were being grown on sewage sludge amended soil in Fiji were indeed accumulating detectable levels of heavy metals and other pollutants as well, because we just looked at heavy metals. So this is a major issue again, because it shows the trophic transfer of pollutants from the soil, through the food chain all the way to humans. And so this is a major issue that, a lot of people are oblivious to. And that is because of bok choy, which is a hypoaccumulator. Like I showed you in the previous slide, the whole cabbage family, they can accumulate metals or other contaminants in the soil. So if you do grow vegetables that are grown on a contaminated environment or contaminated soils, there's a huge risk that contamination is being transferred, into the vegetable and eventually into people that consume that. So I think this highlights the need for standards around, how we use sewage sludge in agriculture, not just in Fiji, but perhaps, in the wider Pacific, to ensure that we have stronger guidelines and stronger standards to ensure that we're screening these amendments before they are disposed or applied in the environment. I think that's one area that EMG is currently working. I think we've been working with some countries here in the Pacific to sort of help them develop what we call effluent or liquid waste standards. I think that will solve a lot of these issues of waste just being, or liquid waste just being um, um, released into the environment without any kind of protocol for monitoring or analyzing and studying the waste. But yeah, if you want to read more on this, you can find the pieces on this link. I think I'll share my presentation with most of you after this session. So, well, we've gone through phytoremediation, briefly gone through phytoremediation now. What are the benefits and perhaps the advantages of phytoremediation? And we compare that to other conventional remediation methods. Well, one is that it is cost effective. Phytoremediation is very cheap. I mean, all you need is a plant, a few amendments here and there, and nothing major. So it's much cheaper compared to other conventional techniques where you have a lot of, equipment, a lot of facilities, and so on. The second benefit of phytoremediation is that it can restore contaminated sites to their natural state, minimal disturbance and intrusiveness. Remember, we're just growing plants here and extracting contamination from the soil. There is no major disruption or destruction of the environment going on here, unlike other methods. So the good thing here is it can restore contaminated environments to their original state without, any kind of disruption to the soil nature, without having to, use any kind of harsh chemicals and so on. And so it is very clean and is non-intrusive. Thirdly, phytoremediation is also aesthetically pleasing. And I think that is what makes phytoremediation very publicly appealing. It's easy to apply. I mean, it's just plants. It's not an eyesore where, it has to be this large structure built or anything applied. It's easy on the eye, doesn't affect the environment, it doesn't change things too much. And so it's aesthetically pleasing and there's more public appeal to phytoremediation. Another thing about phytoremediation is that it's low maintenance. There's not a lot of technical knowledge required there. Anybody can apply phytoremediation. Anybody with the right knowledge can apply phytoremediation. Don't require, essentially it's low maintenance. You don't need to apply too many stuff or know so much, as long as you know how the process works and what you're trying to achieve. And another advantage of phytoremediation is it is applicable for a wide range of pollutants. So unlike other methods that we talked about initially, they are only effective for particular contaminants. But like we said, a lot of brownfields, a lot of contaminated sites have a wide array of different pollutants. So it's good to have a method that can effectively address or clean up all those different hazardous pollutants, not just one. So that is one of the benefits of phytoremediation. It can work for a wide range of pollutants. I mean, you can use 2 or more species of plants you're trying to clean up, a site that has more than one contamination. There's ways around it, to ensure that you're addressing the underlying issue and you're treating all the contaminants in the soil. And yes, again, multiple contaminants can be removed with the same plants. Some plants can hyperaccumulate more than one contaminant. So by using phytoremediation, you're able to remove more than one contaminant from the soil, making it more efficient and more effective than other methods. But you might think, okay, phytoremediation just seems like a wonderful solution to all of our problems. Why don't we just apply it everywhere? Unfortunately, there are limitations and there are still challenges with phytoremediation. So one, it's very slow and it takes time if you're trying to achieve acceptable levels of contamination. Again, because we're using crops grow slowly. So the rate of removal or the rate of remediation is dependent on plant growth. In some cases, estimates have shown that in the US, for example, in some sites, it might take up to 300 years to use, plants to clean up a specific area. And in some cases, that is just not practical, especially if, the contamination is close to residential areas or, close to where people reside, or where you need a more urgent intervention. Then phytoremediation is clearly not a suitable option. It's much slower and it takes a little bit longer. Another problem is it's climate and weather dependent. So again, we're using plants. Plants depend on, environmental conditions in order to grow, thrive, and, survive. So, I mean, in cases where you have adverse, weather events, then that is going to affect, the phytoremediation regime that you're implementing. So that's another major issue. Unfortunately, it is subject to, climate and weather issues. Another issue is it is not suitable for highly contaminated areas. Like I said, in some parts of the US, they've done feasibility studies. They found that phytoremediation would just take too long for them to effectively remediate some areas with high contamination. And in fact, when we're looking at a soil that is highly contaminated, even hyperaccumulated plants will not be able to survive or even grow on that soil. So the level of contamination needs to be, at a level where at least the plants are able to grow and survive. But if the contamination is so high, or the concentration of contaminants in the soil is so high, the plants will not even be able to grow or survive, and that defeats the purpose of phytoremediation. The next thing is, using plants. Phytoremediation is restricted to just sort of the upper surface of the soil. So because, plants are using their roots to extract contaminants from the soil, anything that extends beyond the plant root, the plant cannot get to it. So the plant will not be able to effectively remediate that. So for anything, under a few centimeters or, a few meters perhaps, phytoremediation cannot be applied, unfortunately, because the plants cannot just are not able to get to the contamination. Another point is the possibility of contaminated plants entering the food chain. Remember, when we talk about phytoremediation, the plants are accumulating contamination in their bodies, their leaves, their branches, their stems. So there's a risk that if an animal comes and eats that plant, then that animal is also ingesting that contamination. So what we have is a trophic transfer of contamination because the plant, accumulates the contamination from the soil. A bird, a goat, or any animal eats that plant, and now that contamination is transferred to that animal. And it goes on in the food chain all the way to humans. So that is a risk with phytoremediation. If organisms consume that plant, because that plant is now considered a toxic or a contaminated plant, you cannot afford to have organisms consume or ingest that plant. So that's an issue with phytoremediation. Another problem with phytoremediation is, we've seen a lot of advances in the lab. A lot of studies are being done in the lab and they show these amazing results. But unfortunately, we're not able to take those same results in the field. So even though we've had a lot of success in the field, a lot of case studies, a lot of countries have implemented phytoremediation with success, we're not seeing the same results as in the lab. Partly because, again, in the lab you're in a controlled environment where you control every single parameter to your own liking. But outside in the field, again, nature has its ways, and you're not able to fine tune and change every single parameter to ensure that the plant um, um, concentrates as much metal as it can. So I think that's another major issue with phytoremediation. But nonetheless, we're also seeing some advances in phytoremediation technology. It's been around for like 20 years now, and so as you expect, there's a lot of research being done, and a lot of strides being made with phytoremediation. Thanks to advances in genomics, transcriptomics, and proteomics, we're seeing, plants that are being genetically modified to be able to concentrate and extract contaminants much better from the soil. So that's an area that a lot of research and studies sort of looking at now. How can we modify plants to make them much suited or much better at phytoremediation? Another one is chemically assisted phytoremediation. And this is actually one of the studies that I did where we're trying to apply certain chemicals in the soil to sort of assist the plant to extract any pollutants from the soil. We do this by applying what we call chelating ligands. So chelating ligands essentially assist the plant by breaking down and making contaminants more bioavailable in the soil. So it makes it easier for the plant to extract contaminant from the soil. That's another area that a lot of research is also being done. And we also have microbial assisted phytoremediation, where microbes are being used in the soil to sort of improve the efficiency and improve phytoremediation by plants. But I think that brings us to sort of the main focus of seminar today, which is why is phytoremediation well suited for Pacific Islands? In most part of the world, the interest in phytoremediation is sort of, I'll say, moderate. Again, because the levels of contamination in some places like the US is just so high that phytoremediation is not a practical solution. You know what I mean? It's going to take hundreds of years if you're trying to use plants to clean up, sites that are just, heavily polluted with a range of contaminants. Plants have their limits. You can't just, expect them just to, fix those types of situations. So, but why do I think phytoremediation is well suited for Pacific Islands? I actually, wrote a paper about this. I think it was 2021, last year. where I discussed some reasons why phytoremediation, is well suited for the Pacific Islands. One is, of course, the climate in the region. The tropical climate we have here in the Pacific Islands, is very suited for a wide range of plants. We have the long growing season here, and a lot of rainfall, and just the conditions, the weather, and everything is really good for to support a wide range of crops. So it makes it easier to apply phytoremediation here in the region. Another reason is, and perhaps the biggest reason, is that here in the Pacific, like I said in my opening slide, the level of contamination, most contamination here in the Pacific, is what we consider low to moderate. So it's not like in parts of the world where there's so much proliferation of contaminants to the point where you need much more urgent or much more effective remediation alternatives. Here in the Pacific, a lot of the contamination is what is considered low to moderate. It exists, but the levels are still manageable. And in those types of situations, that's where phytoremediation is really excellent, because crops can really thrive in those types of conditions, and they can really provide a lot of benefits at a very low cost. Thirdly is, of course, the low cost and technical knowledge requirements to apply phytoremediation. So one of the big issues for managing hazardous waste here in the Pacific is the high cost of some of these methods. I recall in our last staff meeting, Memura-san was describing the situation at a Taipangata landfill. I think there was oil leak or used oil leak somewhere in Taipangata landfill that contaminated some soil there, and they were trying to find alternatives or options to apply to clean up contamination. So I mean, imagine if you're looking at a bigger area, this would be very costly. It's very costly to apply conventional remediation alternatives. But phytoremediation is very cost effective. You just need plants, the right management scheme in place, and that's almost about it. You don't need too much, so that makes it very appealing or easily applicable here in the Pacific Islands. And of course, you don't need a lot of knowledge as well. It's not something that is very technically difficult to apply. Once you know the basics of how the process works, you should be able to apply phytoremediation effectively. The fourth reason why phytoremediation is suited for the Pacific Islands is because a lot of contaminated areas in the Pacific are usually isolated from remote areas. So when I showed you some examples of brownfield sites in the Pacific, which is the Lamy dump site or abandoned mines in the Pacific, these are usually isolated areas. So in some cases, there's no urgency perhaps to clean up these areas. And so because of that, phytoremediation is applicable, because the contamination is not something that has to be fixed urgently. It's in more remote areas that can be managed, slowly and with more caution perhaps. But yeah, you can apply phytoremediation because it's not an urgent issue, because these are remote areas where they don't pose significant or acute, risk to human populations or residential areas. So that's another benefit of phytoremediation Pacific Islands. But I have this paper that I published about the application of phytoremediation in Pacific Islands. Discuss some future strategies, perhaps challenges, and also future prospects for technology in the region. you're more than welcome to, yeah, search that up, read that up. If you need it, you can always email me. I can always send you a copy of that paper. So my last slide here is simply about how do we advance phytoremediation and other nature-based interventions or technologies here in the Pacific Islands. I think one very important one is, of course, developing policy guidelines and instruments that will govern the application and also provide some support for phytoremediation and other nature-based systems. I think we need to provide some sort of guidance or map to assist maybe countries or stakeholders, about how they can apply this technology and how it can, fit into legislative frameworks in different countries. So I think that will provide some leverage for advancing phytoremediation in the region. Secondly, I think perhaps most importantly, is raising awareness on phytoremediation and the benefits of this technology. A lot of people are not aware, that plants are able to serve this purpose, and plants can be used to clean up, hazardous pollutants, So I think raising awareness on phytoremediation and the benefits of plants, can really help to, further push the technology, increase its appeal, and yeah, just let people understand that, this can be done. Next, we also have to increase, research into phytoremediation technologies, especially here in the Pacific region. In most part of the world, there's a lot of, studies being done, a lot of publications, on phytoremediation technology. But we need to also do that here in the Pacific, continue to do research in the environments here, especially field trials, and see how phytoremediation can work, on the field in our countries. And lastly, funding. I mean, this is always key for most interventions. We need funding. So we need to find, funding that can help, with further research and funding for projects that are applying for nature-based solutions. Like I said, the QA initiative, that's a project that's providing funding and support nature-based solutions. So that's a good start. I think, we need to continue to, find ways to get funding, into phytoremediation, these type of technologies, show the appeal and how, they can benefit, the environment and the planet as a whole. But yes, that is essentially my presentation today. Before we finish, I just want to say, is there any question from anybody online? Sorry, I can't see any of you. Let me just end this. Oh, there you are. Hi, Karen.
Hey, really interesting talk. Thank you. Hey, I was wondering, has there been any thought around combining phytoremediation with carbon sequestration?
Perhaps, yeah, I think that can work. I think because plants, naturally sequestrate carbon. So I personally haven't looked into that, but I think that can definitely work. I think, plants can simultaneously extract pollutants while at the same time, sequestrating carbon. I think that can work, but I think a lot of the focus is usually more on the pollutant rather than sequestrating carbon. But yeah, I can see how that will definitely work. Any questions? I hope I didn't just ramble on. I hope you guys were actually hearing what I was saying. I didn't drop off somewhere in there.
I've got another question.
Very good, very good.
When you were talking about, you know, the buildup of these toxic components in the bodies of the plants, it did, of course, raise that issue which you've addressed, that it can result in the entry of those contaminants into the food chain via
Yes.
consumption. Obviously, via invertebrates is probably the most likely direction as well. Has there been any research on that? I mean, obviously, you know, if the insects are taking up the plants and then the birds are eating the insects and so on and so forth, there is potential. And you mentioned that, so I wondered if there had actually been any research produced on it.
Very, very good question, Karen. There have been quite a few research that has been done on that. In fact, plants, we call this the plant herbivory defense. Yeah, plant herbivory defense. So some plants naturally extract metals and store it in their bodies as a way of deterring herbivores or herbivory or plants from consuming them. So there's a lot of plants that actually, you know, take up lead and other contamination from the soil, accumulate in their leaves, in their flowers, to prevent insects and other, you know, invertebrates or invertebrates from consuming them as a means or as a way of deterring those plants. So yeah, indeed, it's a whole field of research. It's called plant herbivory defense. But in regards to trophic transfer of heavy metals and other contaminants, you know, that's unfortunately, one of the issues with phytoremediation. And I think some alternatives have been to, you know, maybe use a greenhouse setting or enclosed setting, but it's very challenging. So yeah, some solutions are being, you know, sort of researched and discussed here and there, but yeah, yeah. I hope that answers your question, Karen.
Yeah, no, interesting. I'm familiar with that sort of plant defense approach. You know, it doesn't just apply to insects as well. I mean, for example, there are a lot of plants in Australia that have developed chemical defenses against being grazed by possums, for example.
Yes.
Which is a very effective method, because it means that the possum won't just sit in a tree and eat it to death. It will continue to move around the environment so that it's only getting, you know, a limited amount of the chemical substances that the plant produces. But it'd be interesting to see if, you know, that could evolve, but it takes, I mean, how that's evolved is obviously taking millions of years. So for that to be able to happen, you know, through this mechanism will probably take a similarly long time.
Yes, 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 indeed. Thank you, Karen. I see Paul is there. Paul, any question? Or is he not? Okay. I think you're still muted. Any questions, comments?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the main one would be, has the Pacific Island government used phytoremediation effectively and documented it at a scale, you know, aside from the site? Is it going on in the region? Is there a case study we can point to as a success or what not to do?
Unfortunately, and that's one of the problems. phytoremediation unfortunately has not been trialed and studied in the region as much as it has been globally. In other parts of the world, I mean, in the US, for example, they've applied this to residential areas with, really good success. But here, unfortunately, in the region, we've not had any kind of large or even small scale trials or applications yet. So we've had what we call constructed wetlands. We're using,
Yep.
sort of some plans,
I've seen 'em.
constructing. Yes. So those have been trialed and applied in Fiji, and there's been some success, but not, phytoremediation for soil contamination and as such.
So two things to note for the other attendees and yourself. We've got a follow-up phase of informer developing. What the first pillar of that is establishing environmental standards for Pacific Island countries, including for wastewater and sludge, etc. So that issue about you're talking about in Fiji is something that we're
Yes.
actively trying to fund, starting to address it. Two, we just had a call with UNCCD, the Convention to Combat Desertification in Nauru. And I'll bet Nauru, with their destroyed topside, would be an excellent site to try a little phytoremediation. They have money to do
Yes.
both an assessment and target setting, and they have money from a
Yes.
Jeff project to do some remediation. So it
Yeah.
seems ready-made, and they're asking SPREP for input. So if we can do something simple and straightforward, because I think Nauru is one of these places where complexity is not helpful. So something simple like planting plants would be appropriate level of complexity. There might be an opportunity that exists currently today. So
Yes.
just love that.
Yeah.
I like the idea of growing more plants in Nauru. Thank you so much,
Yes.
Ivan. Really great presentation.
Thank you, Paul. And yeah, that's a really good point. I think I touched on Nauru in one of my papers. I'm not sure if it's published or not. I have to look back, but I think I discussed Nauru's case, the pollution and what's happened, the last century there, and how it can be restored, using plants and other nature-based solutions. So that's a really good discussion, a really good point.
Yeah, maybe we should talk offline about that one, because they've got a $3 million Jeff project right now to do stuff, and SPREP is in there for a few components. So we have a direct line to the permanent secretary and Brian Starr, the director. So if you know stuff, let's talk to Julie about it.
Yes.
Nauru.
Absolutely. Yes.
All right.
No, I think we'll talk about this further. Yes. Thank you, Paul. Vita, any question? I hope you heard my seminar.
Yeah, thank you, bro. Just learned a lot.
Okay.
But yeah, I don't have a specific question myself, but yeah, it's good to know that these problems are much closer to home, especially in the bigger Pacific Island countries and those that have mining and some of these other issues that we don't really have here in Samoa, but obviously it affects us as well if we're not managing our waste properly. But it's very informative. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. So, any more last questions, comments from anyone?
Thanks, Ivan. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Annie.
Well, it's not really a question, just a comment. Thank you for that very informative presentation that you shared with us. We've learned so much and some new terms that we would use in the near future. So yeah, just I wanted to ask if you can share your presentation and some of your papers if with us, so we can share with our staff and for those who haven't joined but they wanted to listen but are busy with other commitments. Yeah, and I think that's it from my side. Thanks, Ivan, for the presentation.
Thank you, Anne. Yes, I will share the presentation with you and find copies of some of my publications. Yeah, I'll send those your way as well.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, Lupe. And well,
Thank you, Evan. I gotta run, but good talking with you. Talk again soon.
yes.
See you all
Thank you,
later.
Paul. Yes, thank you all, team, for joining me today. It's really a pleasure, and I'm glad you're able to join me for this ride. I hope you all learned something new, maybe a new term, or a new process. But any questions, Karen? Okay. But yeah, thank you for. Oh my, sorry, it's already 1 hour 48 minutes in. Hello, Vanny.
Hi, Ivan. Thank you for presentation.
Thank you,
Thank
Vanny.
you, bro.
Thank you. All
Thanks,
right.
Ivan.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much. Thank you so much,
everyone.
everybody.
All right.
You have a great day.
You too.
Likewise.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.